everyone, and welcome to week 9 of Research and Information Skills. This week, the question that I'm posing is, what is the research cycle? And I'll explain that as we go along. But before I say anything else, I have to apologise if the volume, the audibility of these recordings has been slightly low. And the reason for that is there's probably a range of reasons, but the principal one is that I was in an office where it was very difficult to actually project my voice in terms of having several people around me who are quite sensitive to noise, and so I was quite paranoid about how loud my voice was, and so I reduced it according to the sensibilities of the people around me. The other thing is I've got a cold, as you can probably hear by my voice. I apologise in the sense that it may obviously change the way my voice sounds. I'm on the mend, not that that matters to you, but it certainly matters to me. And I'm hoping, like I said, that I don't have too many interruptions. And the final thing that I'll say, which is important in terms of the recordings, is that we have some building works going on in the campus here at Cradle Coast. So if you hear some banging or some clanging or any other kind of strange noises in the background of this recording, you'll know what that is. They're actually refurbing our video conferencing system, and it happens to be about 2 rooms down from me. Anyway, back to the session at hand. If you could have a look at the PowerPoint for this week, because I'm going to be running through that obviously and mentioning certain slide numbers. Anyway, what I want to look at this week in terms of the research cycle is first of all how we might frame an issue, and I pose a question and then obviously go through or follow through with the research process. The second thing I want to look at is planning the research to a specific question, which again I accept perhaps reiterates or repeats past weeks in terms of looking at an essay question, for instance, and I do apologise for that if you're doing academic writing, because this may be slightly repetitious, but to me it's a kind of fairly involved process, and a crucial process in the sense that you'll be doing it every time you have some sort of task to complete for an assignment. Now, moving on, I mean, we're going to be looking at following leads and in terms of doing research, and then how we might reframe questions to answer specific questions. So in other words, how we might take an angle or an approach to a question that is not exactly perhaps aligned to the question we're meant to be doing, but it still informs or has some bearing on it. So in other words, that we may take an approach and an approach that answers the question, but perhaps in a slightly indirect way. But anyway, we'll get to that. If everyone can have a look at slide 3 of the PowerPoint, it's simply titled The Research Cycle, rather unimaginatively on my part. Anyway, I've put in the middle as I guess a flow diagram that you get an assignment, any assignment. It could be an academic report that you have to do, an essay, maybe even, I don't know, some other sort of evaluative task. Anyway, with the assignment usually comes a question or an instruction. We have to, as individuals, work at how we have to frame the question. And by framing, I simply mean understanding the question or task in the context of the information we have about it or that we're going to get about it, and then obviously begin the process of actually, hopefully, acquiring enough information to answer that particular task or question. So I've put as a second part of the flow diagram as planning, and I see planning as crucial. It occurs in both the initial stages when we're actually looking for material for a particular task, but also it happens when we're about to complete the task, so we've got the information, etc. Obviously from the planning stage, we work out, as I've said in previous weeks, we work out how we unpack a particular question or task, work out what the parts of it that we actually need to either define or approach in a slightly different way, and then we go out and search. So finding's our third one. Obviously we do a lot of reading in the meantime, and I've said several times on these tapes or recordings that my belief is that you allow as much time to do the research as for the writing. And I know perhaps that is a little out of kilter with perhaps how some of you work, but for me personally, being well armed with information, so having more information than I need is better than having less. And the reason I say that is I've had examples this week of marking papers, and have very quickly discovered and realised that there's perhaps a third of the students in my group who have not done enough reading, who do not cover the material enough, and they're trying to camouflage it within their writings, but it's fairly apparent that they simply don't have the depth of knowledge, and that comes through in their assignment, comes through in their writing. Anyway, after you do your reading, you often reframe your approach to a particular task or assignment. And by reframing, I mean you might simply realise that there's several perspectives to be taken on a particular point, and you decide, for whatever reason, perhaps just even personal interest, that you want to take a certain approach. So you reframe your perspective, and you may redirect your efforts in terms of seeking out information. So that then usually you focus your research, so you get maybe more information about that particular angle that you're taking, that particular perspective. You bring that back to the table, you plan, and again there's that crucial word, plan, how you're actually going to write an essay, but more crucially, how you're going to use the information you've got in terms of citations, etc., how you're going to use that within your work. And so you develop a writing plan which has the overlay of the information you've got, so the quotes, etc. And obviously then you begin your writing the writing process. Now, it doesn't end there, as far as writing. I'm a great believer that the drafting process is probably fairly important, but the proofreading and redrafting perhaps is the essential part in terms of achieving marks. So you may write an initial draft, realise that perhaps it doesn't quite fit the perspective you're trying to actually get across. You then replan or remap the writing, and then redraft the work. And as far as I'm concerned, there's generally a grade, at least, in simply being very specific about how you proofread and edit. Now, on slide 4, I've got a fairly extensive flow diagram about how these things can work or operate in terms of doing research. I won't go into too much detail here. I think it's fairly clear. But again, like I said, if you have any questions, by all means, contact me. Anyway, I want to move to, because I'm quite aware that some of these recordings do go perhaps too long. I'm a great believer in being concise, and so maybe sometimes that's to my detriment, and certainly to yours in case I'm not offering enough information, and I apologise for that. However, if we look at the question or the focus for this week, I wanted to ask the question, what are the social consequences of divorce? Now, this could have been any question. I guess I arbitrarily chose this question. And I guess I should give you some background. The reason I chose this question is I used to do, when I was working in England, I was working on sociology, and part of one of the units that I was doing was related to the family, and I used to do quite a bit of work with obviously with my students around things like divorce and the consequences, and we ended up doing some projects, and ended up doing obviously research for group work, etc., in the context of my classes. And for me, it's an interesting question because it's something that we're all aware of to some extent, but we're not actually quite sure to what depth the consequences may affect the individuals involved. And there are significant effects or consequences, as is indicated by the question. Now, on slide 6, I've done, in the briefest possible terms, a quick mind map about what the possible social consequences of divorce. As far as I'm concerned, you have to contextualise divorce, so you'd have to get some sort of historical information about divorce, and I haven't included that on there, but I think personally I could have. It wouldn't involve a huge amount of reading. I think you'd probably wouldn't spend more than an hour or so looking at the history of divorce, etc. I think another thing that you'd have to find out is what are the principal causes of divorce. And even though this is only background information, it still would inform, I think, to some extent, your introduction to a question like this. Now, obviously moving more directly to the question at hand, we'd have to look at, okay, what are the costs to society? And I've only put two items there. Are there, do crime rates increase? In other words, that people who are divorced generally end up worse off in terms of their financial situation. And so is there an increase in crime rate, perhaps in theft or fraud or a range of other crimes? And I'm not suggesting here that all divorcees are bound towards or prone to criminality. Not at all. I'm just wondering if necessarily that could be a consequence. So for me, that's just almost a rhetorical question or proposition. However, the one that's very real to me is welfare. Okay, if we look at welfare both for children and for the adults involved in divorce, I would argue there would be an increase in welfare needs or demands from families who go through divorce. It may be temporary, but I would suggest that, and it certainly was the case in England, that people who go through divorce generally, one of the partners, and in this case, generally it's the woman, because she often keeps the children or has custody of the children, I should say, and because of that, often women, particularly if the children are younger, she has to stay at home, and then attracts welfare benefits, which is a good thing and as it should be. But anyway, that's definitely a consequence, a social consequence, certainly an economic consequence. I've put in a larger box other consequences, and I think there has to be other things considered in this, even if they're not necessarily major ones. You might tip your hat to them, perhaps in the first or second paragraph of the body of the essay, simply saying there are other consequences, but I'm going to concentrate on these particular ones. Say for instance welfare. The other effects, I've looked at sort of two categories, and I could have had three at least, maybe a lot more. Because you could argue that rather than just children and grandparents, obviously you're looking at the couple directly involved, you're looking at the community itself, for instance. So if there are consequences, say for instance with children who are struggling through divorce, that has an effect on what's happening to them in terms of their participation in education, the levels of attainment, and certainly their retention may go down, and that would be another thing that maybe we could look into. And I've put there on the slide, on slide 6, academic performance. And I think you'd probably find some correlations between divorce, certainly in the immediate term, and a drop of some degree in academic performance from children, particularly younger children. Was not necessarily to suggest that it would follow through. The other one is the psychological effects. If we're going to look at children, okay, what is the impact? And we know, because research has been done on it through psychology, we know that there are psychological effects of divorce, and quite significant ones. Now on slide 7, I literally in the space of about 10 minutes came up with 12 questions, and I won't necessarily read them all out here, but I think for me, if I was going to investigate this subject, I'd want to know bits of each of these questions, even if they don't have a major bearing on my answer to the particular task. I would simply like these as background information, only because it gives you a depth of knowledge and it gives you a certain level of confidence when you're actually answering a question like this. And I'd be interested to see, like I said, if you sat down with a question like this, what are the questions you might pose, and it's worth considering. Now on slide 8, as I've done in previous weeks, I've got an inverted pyramid or triangle. And what I've looked at in this case is, okay, what definitions will we need to actually kind of make sense of this question, particularly in an introduction, for instance. I think, like I said, it has to be contextualised to some sense, so we're looking at the social consequences of divorce, how long ago, how far are we going back, for instance. So we'd have to get some general information about divorce and society. Obviously there's some general information. We might want to find out the reasons, the causes, who and where, so who are more likely to divorce, for instance, and then look at some of the elements of the consequences. And I've put 5 in there, but there's multiple ones. So, I mean, stigma around divorce, which I think to some degree is faded with modern society. Obviously welfare and crime, I think, have to be investigated. How far, I'm not sure. I think health, and there is definitely health consequences of divorce in terms of stress and the impact of stress, and obviously employment. And I think all of those things could legitimately be investigated and perhaps explored. although personally I think depending on the word count you'd only want to pick one or two up and maybe simply express your knowledge about the others in a way that is succinct, is brief, and simply say that you understand there are other consequences, but this is the one you're concentrating on because you see this as perhaps the primary social consequence. I've put a brief definition there of what divorce is, and I think again you have to have a working definition of all the terms you're using. In this case, obviously, we need to know what is a divorce, and never believe that it's not worth putting in a definition. Be explicit about these things. I mean, it doesn't have to be from necessarily a dictionary or any other source necessarily, but for me personally, I would always start with some sort of definition if I'm looking at a particular term. Now, in slide 9, I have a pie chart which gives you an indication of the percentages of divorce against the years people are married. And I think it's fairly intriguing that the highest bracket, certainly combined, but even individually, if you look at the years 5 to 9, you've got nearly 25% of people divorcing in that bracket. But if you combine that with the under fives, 13, you're looking closer towards 40%, for instance. Now, for me, like I said, that's kind of interesting. That what happens in those initial years. Is it about compatibility? Is it about finances? Is it about living arrangements? Is it about children? The stresses of having children. But there's quite a high percentage. Quite a high percentage of divorces that occur in these years, and it would be worth asking questions why. Surprisingly, I think the 10 to 14 years, that's still nearly 20%, which again is kind of interesting. What happens, you would assume that after a decade of living together, a decade and longer, that perhaps some of the issues had been ironed out, but obviously not. Things happen. And as a whole, if you go from 0 to 15 years, you've got over 50% of all marriages dissolving for whatever reasons, which is not necessarily stats you could use to bear on necessarily your answer to the question, but however, it's worth knowing about some of the stresses and strains within those years, at least to contextualise your answer about divorce. Now, moving to slide 10, I've kind of put up 4 possible ways. There's multiple ways you can answer this question, but to me these are the kind of 4 obvious ways you could probably attempt this question. They are, first of all, taking a global view. So in other words, you try and look at all of the consequences of divorce, which depending on the word count would be very thin on the ground in terms of information you could offer, statistics you could back it up, and evidence that you could back it up. So for me, like I said, it would be very difficult. You may say a lot, but not specifically on certain things. The other is maybe take a case study and generalise it. By the case study, I mean take a particular consequence. So you look at well, I should backtrack there. Sorry. So you take a case study. Maybe you take an incident of divorce, and then work from there to look at all the, the tentacles or arms of consequences that come from that. Sorry about the interruption. I had a phone call which I didn't expect from a student. Anyway, getting back to the case study. In terms of the case study, like I said, and I'm sorry to repeat it, although my trail of thought has just been lost care of the phone call, quite a serious one I might add. It won't happen again. Anyway, so you take a case study. So you take an example of a couple who divorce, and then you look at and map what the consequences are for all the stakeholders within that divorce. So obviously the couple themselves, the children, grandparents, etc. And what are the things that you could measure the consequences by? And to me, that's a fairly interesting thing to do. It's a bit risky in the sense that depending on the example that you use, you might not be able to generalise from it too easily. But anyway, worth a look. The other thing is taking a single consequence. So we look at something, say for instance, employment, and look at the individual's history of employment, and then what happens at the point of divorce and beyond, and have a look. And obviously, in terms of employment, then you're looking at things like finance, You're also looking at perhaps things that are connected with that in terms of health insurance, etc. And for instance, types of schooling that children receive, etc. So it has some significant bearing and could include the others. The other way that you could possibly do it is take two related consequences, and I think they're all related in some way because they all have the same genesis point. And then you would connect the outcomes of both and how they might be linked to other consequences without actually exploring the other consequences with any depth. Now on slide 11, I look at possible points of focus. So we could actually look at from a social perspective, so society, what happens to society in terms of divorce, and I've put there a graphic which looks at certain areas, so welfare, justice system, police, industry, healthcare. How are these things impacted by divorcing couples? The other way you could look at is the individual. So we go from macro to micro in a sense. That we look at, okay, what are the consequences for the individual? In this case, it might be mental health, physical health, etc. And those things, again, you may not explore all of them, but it might be worth looking at and trying to find the links between each, and maybe exploring one to tie into another, for instance. Now, if we were to narrow a topic according to my examples in the previous slide, I personally would be interested in looking at something like health. I would look at the consequences of divorce and look at, okay, possibly what happens to divorcees? Does their health improve or does it get significantly worse? In essence, if I'm looking at how I narrow a topic on slide 12, I would map that through to the effects on adult health, and may even narrow it further down to women's health. And there's research that I know of that is related to that. Now, from slides 13 to 15, I have attempted to cover a range of different areas in terms of health, but particularly and moving on to women's health as a point of concentration for my research. All this information that I gathered in those three slides, and I apologise for the kind of density of the text on the slides themselves, took me perhaps half an hour to get together. And I imagine, obviously, if I looked at how I'd scaffold the work in terms of referencing and citations, etc., I'd have to be more thorough. I'd obviously have to check these information and make sure that it's qualified, that it's cogent, etc. But initially it didn't take very long, for instance, to actually get the material that I needed. So if I were to look at, say, for instance, women and divorce and the consequences for them in terms of individual consequences, I might first of all focus on mental health, and then the consequences of mental health, and I'm talking about stress, etc., depression, grief, etc., how that would have and how that might impact children, and then have a flow-on effect to their education. But more directly with the women involved, obviously you'd have issues around healthcare, possibly around welfare, justice in terms of divorce proceedings, etc., and employment. Equally, that may have broader and longer-term effects for children who may need to access the healthcare system, welfare and justice systems, and may have longer-term employment issues via a divorce. So there are significant social consequences for women and their offspring. If we broaden that out to look at men and women, and we still concentrate on individual consequences as opposed to sort of macro or structural consequences or social consequences, we would go through more or less the same range of issues and look at the same types of flow-on effects, so areas that would be affected directly by what happens between a couple who divorce. And in this case, we're looking at a case study. So as I said earlier, we take one example and then we generalise from that example. And providing we have a good enough example, we could probably map out all of those different areas quite comfortably. However, if we covered all aspects, as I said, we generalised. We looked at all the different areas. For a start, it's going to be a fairly large research project. We're going to have to do a fair amount of reading, I would argue. We'd have to scout round and scope out what are the major findings and facts relating to each of these areas. I would argue, as I've written on the slide, due to the large number of factors, your research will be circumscribed by time and word count. So in other words, maybe you can designate one paragraph for each of these, providing the word counts there. If it's not, then you'd have to combine them. On slide 19, I've looked at, okay, how does research shape answers to questions? And in this case, we may have done general search and found a whole range of different social consequences, but decided for perhaps a whole range of reasons that we wanted to concentrate on women and the health issues related to divorce. Maybe that is a major issue or area that comes up through our research. So we then would frame that, perhaps we look at a single aspect, say mental health for instance, and divorce related to women. So we reframe the question in a sense, so we might say, how do issues relating to women, mental health and divorce impact society? So we're making an immediate link. We know there is a consequence of mental health issues, perhaps for women, and I'd argue for men as well. And then that would reframe the way we answer the actual question. So we're looking through a particular lens, a particular consequence, and obviously a figure, in this case women, to broadly answer our question. Now, I've left an activity on slide 20. I'd like to consider one of those questions and perhaps go through the process that I've just outlined. Not necessarily in the same sorts of detail because you don't have the time and obviously you've got assignments to do, but if you could at least attempt the things that I've stated on slide 21. So develop a research plan, describe a possible reframing of the question, and present your answer to the essay question to the wider group. So I'm hoping that maybe, like I said, if we have or if you come up with answers, perhaps, like I said, that maybe you'd like to put them on a discussion board, for instance. Anyway, I've probably said a lot, perhaps too much as usual. I do apologise for the interruption in the middle. I should have been far more aware of my telephone, so I do apologise for that again. Anyway, I hope you're doing well with assignment 2 and looking at already framing and beginning the research for assignment 3, because remember, it's a fairly big project, but at least it's one that hopefully is of interest to you. Anyway, have a great week. Talk to you next week. Bye.